Before the dance selection, my ex-boyfriend tricked me into going on a trip and drugged me with sleeping pills. As a result, I missed the selection and was seen by others as the bad girl who spent the night out with her boyfriend and went missing for a day. When everyone pointed fingers at me, he broke up with me via a text message. He pushed me into hell. 5 years later, when I returned to the country pregnant, he was filled with guilt, holding me and begging for my forgiveness. A week before my mother passed away, I was used by the boyfriend I had worked so hard to win over, losing my chance in the competition. All he left me with was the word breakup. A week later, my mother jumped off the roof. That day, I lost everything and had to watch that woman, supported by my father's hand, walk into the funeral hall and pretend to mourn. The boyfriend who dumped me held that woman's hand and called her mom. My world collapsed and I fell into a deep depression, which eventually led to my failure in the college entrance exams. In less than 6 months, my father married that woman. She was his first love from his youth. They had separated due to misunderstandings, leading my father to marry into my mother's family. But she had married the wrong person and quickly divorced. Now fate had brought them back together. Her name was proudly registered in our household records, and the boy I once liked the most told me I couldn't tell anyone about our past relationship. I fled like a rat crossing the street, escaping abroad and not returning home for 5 years. 5 years later, my father called, begging me to come home and telling me that the woman was pregnant with his child. As I got off the plane and walked out of the airport, I saw Quentin Jennings. He strode towards me. I looked up and met his gaze. Neither of us spoke first, and he bent down to grab my suitcase. I took a step back, and his outstretched hand awkwardly hung in the air. Back then, he wore a school uniform, tall and handsome, with an indifferent expression on his face. He stood under the national flag, giving speeches while the teachers on stage looked at him with pride and admiration. The girls below couldn't suppress their adoration. At that time, I stood beside him, and with a slight turn of my head, I could see his lowered eyes and the curve of his mouth. In front of Quentin, I was no different from the other girls. Now he was dressed in a suit, still with that calm expression. He no longer looked like a boy, having shed his youthfulness, standing tall and straight, making my neck ache just to look up at him. "Holly Baxter, you?" Quentin paused. "Why did you suddenly come back? I heard we're going to have a little brother." I came back to ask what his last name will be. I hadn't expected Quentin to be so well informed. While my biological father was still clueless, begging me to return, Quentin already knew I was back, even knowing my flight details, waiting outside the airport early. "Go home." Quentin avoided answering my question, opening the car door for me. I curled my lips. "I'm not going back with you." "Then who are you going with?" Quentin frowned. I used to love seeing him frown. It made him look both frustrated and cute. I would reach out and smooth his brow. He would look up at me, his faint smile making my heart race. But now I couldn't reach his brow, nor did I want to smooth out his frustration. "I'm going to my mother's grave." I looked him in the eye, completely at ease. "Are you coming with me?" Quentin's face stiffened. He got into the car without a word and drove off. Quentin had always believed that my mother's interference caused his mother to marry the wrong man and waste her youth. How could he possibly accompany me to pay respects at her grave? I looked up at the sky. The blinding sunlight made me squint. I remembered that the day of my mother's funeral was also like this, with clear skies and a deceptive sense of everything being fine in the world. But only my family was shrouded in grief with cries of sorrow. 5 years ago, my mother committed suicide by jumping off a building due to severe depression, and not one of us knew she had been suffering from it. By the time I got home, it was already dark. Everyone who should have been seated at the dinner table was present. My pregnant stepmother, her son and daughter, and my biological father. Except for my stepmother, Miranda Doyle, and her daughter, Jenna Doyle, who were about to start eating, Quentin and my father hadn't touched their food. My father looked at me with a mix of caution and eagerness to please. "Holly, why didn't you tell me you were coming back? If Quentin hadn't seen you at the airport today, I wouldn't have known you were returning." My father stood up hurriedly, fumbling as he pulled out a chair for me. I didn't respond, but Jenna spoke first. "Holly, if you had come back with Quentin, it would have been safer. It's risky for a girl to take a taxi so late at night." Jenna had clearly inherited her mother's talent for saying things that seemed genuine but were laced with barbs. Miranda gave her daughter an approving look, then turned to me with a soft voice. "Holly, we've been worried about you. I went to visit my mom." I couldn't stand listening to Miranda anymore. I haven't been back in 5 years. I had to talk to her. At the mention of my mom, Miranda's expression froze, and the rest of her words got stuck in her throat. "Visiting your mother is a good thing. She must miss you very much." My father glanced nervously at Miranda before turning to me with a broad smile. "Sit down and eat. You must be hungry." Most of the dishes had already been picked over. Who were they saving them for? Just as I sat down, Miranda gave Jenna a meaningful look, and Jenna quickly helped Miranda to her feet. "Dad, Mom seems a bit uncomfortable. Maybe she's been sitting too long. I'll help her upstairs to rest for a bit." That Dad was grating. As Jenna supported her mother, she shot me a triumphant glance. "Dad, I'm not leaving the country again." Miranda and Jenna both stopped in their tracks. I casually picked up a fork and scraped it hard against the smooth white porcelain plate. "I plan to start working at the company." That's the company my mother left behind, the one Miranda had maneuvered Quentin into, and he's now the CEO. Once Jenna had her fill of fun, she would probably be placed there too, allowing Miranda to easily take over my mother's company. The company my mother left behind must bear my name. I gripped the fork tightly, looking at Miranda's ashen face and Jenna's bewildered expression. It's time for me to move out of the shadows. I don't want to let my mother's company go to waste. Of course, of course. My father nodded enthusiastically, tears welling up in his eyes. He had always thought I was trapped in the shadow of my mother's death and couldn't move on. Now that I had taken the initiative to inherit my mother's company, he was naturally overjoyed. "But Holly studied art abroad," Miranda said, her face pale as she clutched her stomach, with Jenna guiding her back to her seat. "It's better to let Quentin continue helping out. He's a finance graduate after all." Now that the company is finally on track, suddenly changing leadership could cause problems. Miranda glanced at me, her smile strained, not expecting me to get straight to the point as soon as I returned. "Let Holly learn first, and when she's ready, she can take over the company. Changing leadership now could destabilize things." "Don't worry, Auntie," I said through gritted teeth, forcing out those words. "I'm not planning to take over the company yet, not for at least 8 months. Why?" As soon as Miranda asked, she instinctively looked down at her own swollen belly, her hands immediately wrapping protectively around it as she stared at me warily. I set down the fork and gently placed my hands on my abdomen. "Because I'm pregnant. I won't be taking over until after the baby is born." The room fell silent. I heard something drop beside me. Quentin's phone had slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The screen cracked like a spider web, spreading in all directions. Along with it, his calm and composed demeanor also shattered. After taking a shower, I came out of the bathroom, drying my hair as I looked around my room. It seemed exactly the same as 5 years ago, yet somehow different. Everything was in the same place without a speck of dust. The housekeeper, Cassidy, had been nagging, telling me that my father cleaned the room every day. Even though he never truly loved my mother, he genuinely loved me. If it hadn't been for me crying and clinging to his leg all those years ago, he might have left my mother and me to be with Miranda 20 years ago. In hindsight, maybe that would have been the better ending. A 2-year-old Holly cried and clung tightly to her father's leg, keeping him by her side. But 18-year-old Holly couldn't hold on to her mother. So what about 23-year-old Holly? I touched my slightly rounded belly. When my father found out I was pregnant, he was furious, almost slamming his fist on the table, wanting to scold me, to yell at me. How could an unmarried girl get pregnant? But he held back. He suppressed his anger and asked who the father was. I casually said, "He's dead." He froze, helpless and heartbroken. In the end, he just told me to go rest in my room, that we'd talk about everything tomorrow. "You're really something," I said softly, gently rubbing my belly. The news of my pregnancy was undoubtedly a devastating blow to Miranda. She had been counting on her child to one day inherit the Baxter Company, meticulously paving the way for Quentin and Jenna. But she hadn't expected me to come back with a child of my own. Not only am I the first in line to inherit the Baxter name, but I've also brought back the next heir. Her carefully laid plans were all for nothing. A sudden knock on the door pulled me out of my thoughts. I cleared my throat. "Who is it?" There was a moment of silence outside the door. "It's me." Quentin had come. "Wait a moment, I'm changing clothes." I intentionally dragged it out for half an hour before opening the door. "Brother, what's up?" I deliberately placed my hand protectively over my stomach, calmly looking at Quentin. "Whose child is it?" Quentin gritted his teeth as he looked at me. One hand gripped the door frame, and he had already stepped one foot into my room. He was prepared to stop me from closing the door to avoid the question. "My ex-boyfriends." I stared at him with a challenging smile. Quentin's usually calm face now looked dark and troubled. "Which ex-boyfriend?" "The last one." This absurd exchange thoroughly enraged Quentin. With no one else around, he grabbed my arm and yanked me into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. Quentin was tall and imposing. He leaned in close, trapping me firmly within the space of his arms. "You closed the door too loudly just now." My gaze drifted over his shoulder toward the door. "What will you do if someone in the house hears? Will you scold me as an older brother teaching his sister a lesson? Or will you tell everyone that you're my ex-boyfriend?" It took Quentin a moment to force out his next words. "Don't tell me you got pregnant by some random guy just to get back at me. You give yourself too much credit," I said with a bitter laugh. "I wouldn't degrade myself just to spite you. Besides, you were the one who broke up with me 5 years ago. We're both clean now. Please don't drag the baby into this, okay?" I gently caressed my belly in front of Quentin. "I don't want this child to be born because of some meaningless reason." Quentin's hand clenched into a fist, his eyes growing red, his furrowed brow looking almost pitiful. He was starting to resemble the boy from 5 years ago. A top student, handsome, calm on the surface but always showing his emotions through his furrowed brows. "Quentin, do you think I came back with this baby just to get revenge on you?" I pushed Quentin away with a slight force. He seemed to lose all his strength, easily allowing the distance between us to widen. "My life doesn't revolve around your family. Your mom married my dad?" I paused, feeling the urge to laugh. "In the 5 years I've been away, you must have had a great time like a real family." Quentin flinched at my gaze and I stepped closer. "A father, a mother, a reliable older brother, a cute little sister. You told me this was the life you always dreamed of. Quentin, why did you agree to date me 5 years ago?" I finally asked Quentin face to face. 5 years ago, he broke up with me with just one sentence, leaving me as the school's laughingstock. I felt like a trapped animal, unable to understand, unable to make sense of it. Then my mother committed suicide by jumping off a building, and it seemed like every possible bad thing that could happen in the world happened to me. Now his mother has moved into our home, fulfilling her perfect marriage, and the story between Quentin and me from 5 years ago has turned into an unspeakable melodramatic past. But there are some things I have to get answers to. Why did you take me on a trip 2 months before the college entrance exams? My gaze was intense, almost burning holes into Quentin, and my voice started to tremble. Why did you drug me with sleeping pills? From the moment Quentin agreed to date me, my life began to fall apart. 18-year-old Holly. When Quentin said, "I do," it felt like everything around me started to collapse except for Quentin, who stood there perfectly fine, smiling warmly with gentle eyes. I had come to him with a do-or-die determination, asking if he would be willing to fill out the exact same college applications as me. My face was flushed, my ears buzzing, and my heart racing. After saying, "I do," Quentin immediately followed up with, "Then would you be willing to be my girlfriend right now?" I stammered, not knowing what to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Are you saying this all of a sudden?" Quentin froze, looking a bit embarrassed, and covered his face with his hand. "I thought you were confessing to me just now, but I can't let the girl I like confess to me without saying something back." The usually serious boy blushed deeply because of this sentence. I gasped, and before I could say anything, tears started streaming down my face. 2 months before the college entrance exams, I successfully started dating the boy I had secretly admired for 3 years. Through Quentin's words, I gradually learned more about him. His parents divorced when he was very young. Although he lived with his father soon remarried, and his stepmother gave birth to a younger brother, 2 years his junior. on his biological mother's side. She also remarried and had a younger sister. He had many family members, yet he didn't fit in with either family, becoming more withdrawn and silent over time. Whenever Quentin talked about his family, there was always a deep sadness in his eyes. I felt so sorry for him that I would nervously put my hand on his, holding it tightly. After the college entrance exams, I planned to introduce Quentin to my parents, to give him a sense of security. We would even attend the same university in the same city. Day and night, I wanted to be with him. Just thinking about it made my face flush. I wanted to bury my face in my workbook, but Quentin suddenly reached out to pat my head. I was so startled that I coughed repeatedly, burying my face in my arms, unwilling to look at him. He laughed beside me, making me both angry and embarrassed. I tried to hit him, but he caught my hand and held it in his palm. When I finally dared to lift my face and glance at him, Quentin was lying on the desk, smiling at me with his face turned to the side. His eyes were filled with laughter, the sunlight on the desk warm and golden, and his gentle smile was blindingly bright. I willingly fell for that fleetingly gentle smile. Maybe I felt too sorry for him, so when the school notified me that I was selected to represent the city in a national dance competition, and Quentin suggested we go out for some relaxation, I didn't refuse. 3 days before the competition, Quentin suddenly proposed a trip together. I had been busy preparing for the dance competition and hadn't seen him, so I was even more sensitive to the sadness in Quentin's demeanor. If I pass this competition, I'll get a guaranteed spot in college, but Quentin is facing the imminent pressure of the college entrance exams. If he wants to go out, he must be under a lot of stress. With this dismissive attitude, I agreed to Quentin's request. That day, I nervously lied to my family, feeling both anxious and excited as I got on a long-distance bus with Quentin to a small fishing village by the sea. The scenery there wasn't particularly beautiful, and there weren't any famous landmarks, but just being on a trip with Quentin made me incredibly happy. However, Quentin seemed distracted, so I kept holding his hand as we walked along the beach, chattering on about our future hopes. I wanted to use our promises to dispel the shadows lingering in his heart. Even though not all promises can be fulfilled, the more we talk about them, the greater the chance some will come true, right? By the time the sun was setting, I realized there were no buses left to take us back. Hand in hand, we stared at the sign announcing the bus service had ended, both of us blushing. When we went to the hotel to book a room, my head was so low it was almost buried in Quentin's chest. I could even feel him slightly shaking with suppressed laughter. In the end, we only got one room. Quentin explained that he was worried something might happen if I stayed alone, and he blushed as he assured me he would sleep on the floor that night. After taking a shower, I lay on the bed, finally managing to fend off my parents' messages on my phone. Quentin squatted in front of me, silently and gently towel drying my damp hair. With the person I liked so close, I couldn't help but lean forward slightly, quickly brushing my soft lips against his cheek. Quentin's face visibly turned red as he continued to gently dry my hair, struggling to suppress a smile. The atmosphere made my mouth dry. I could feel how much my boyfriend liked me. Quentin thoughtfully brought me a glass of water, and I drank a lot, trying to ease the dryness in my throat. With the lights off, I lay in bed, occasionally hearing the sound of waves outside the window. Quentin. Quentin's husky voice came from beside the bed. I was so embarrassed that I gripped the blanket tightly with both hands. After we get into college, let's come back here again. Do you like it here? From now on, this will be the place of our first trip together. I turned over, looking at Quentin's soft hair, feeling a sweet warmth in my heart. No matter how many places we go in the future, this will always be my favorite. It was a long time before I heard a faint reply from beside the bed, just as I was drifting off to sleep. Okay. Your acting skills are really impressive. Thinking about my naive self from that night makes my heart ache again. I pity the 18-year-old Holly who was still dreaming that all her hard work would be rewarded with applause and cheers, that my parents would be proud of my outstanding performance, and that Quentin would surely be standing in the audience, smiling at me, perhaps holding a bouquet of flowers. At that moment, I'd rush to him without hesitation, hug him tightly, and proudly tell everyone that he was my boyfriend. I slept for a whole day and night. By the time I made it back, the dance selection was out of my reach. And because I had been out of touch for an entire day, my parents, they even reported me missing to the police. So everyone knew that Holly had gone missing for a day because she spent the night out with her boyfriend. What were you thinking when you made me drink that glass of water laced with sleeping pills? And how did you watch me sleep for a whole day and night? Did every passing second not bring him any pressure or guilt? I knew you would question me about this someday. Quentin looked at my stomach with bloodshot eyes. But I didn't expect you to question me while carrying someone else's child. I'm sorry. His apology couldn't possibly make things right. Back then, it wasn't just about missing the dance selection that broke me. It was the look of disbelief in my parents' eyes. They hadn't believed I could do something so reckless. Yet I disappointed them in front of the entire school, the teachers, and even the police. All you said to me then was, "Let's break up." I desperately asked you why, but you vanished without a trace. You even avoided me by preparing for exams at home, leaving me alone to face the ridicule and cold stares from the entire school. During that time, I drifted aimlessly through life, enduring the contempt of others. My parents arranged for me to study at home, but all I wanted was to see Quentin. I couldn't focus on anything else until I got answers. When I finally managed to escape from home, I found Quentin. From across the street, I saw him. He was holding hands with a slender girl, smiling at her tenderly, making me feel utterly ridiculous. Even more absurd was that I knew that girl. Her name was Jenna. She was the second-place winner who lost to me in the previous competition, and she was the one who replaced me in the dance selection. Quentin and Jenna, even their names seemed so well-matched. Compared to them, Holly seemed so out of place. Was there any need to ask why? I wasn't just dumped, I was played, and thoroughly so. There's no need to go into what happened next. It was even more devastating. All I wanted was to get back at Jenna. But when my actions were exposed, I found out that Jenna was Quentin's half-sister from his mother's side. This misunderstanding turned all my emotions into a ridiculous farce. My father was furious that I would bully someone like that, and, for the first time, he yelled at me in disappointment. I felt so ashamed of myself, so I shut myself away at home. The only comfort I had was from my mom. She said a lot of things to me, and gradually I started to come to terms with it. I leaned on my mom and cried for an entire night. Afterward, I decided to forget everything that had happened. Even if it was just for my mom, I had to keep going. Then my mom jumped off a building. At her funeral, I saw Quentin supporting a woman as they entered the hall where my mom's memorial was held. My father eagerly went over to talk to her. She cried pitifully in my father's arms. I heard Quentin call her mom. I stood before my mom's black and white photo, crying until my voice was hoarse, my eyes red and swollen, looking ugly and dazed as I watched them. My first life ended in June when I was 18. I stared at Quentin, whose eyes were red with guilt. He seemed to want to say "I'm sorry" over and over, but he couldn't say a single word. Now it was my turn to speak. I looked at Quentin and softly said, "Get out, Quentin." 6. On my first night back home, I dreamed of my mom again. I dreamed of my younger self playing in the garden with her while my father sat quietly on the side, watching us. I panted as I lay on my mom's lap, and she gently reached out to stroke the hair stuck to my sweaty face. Mom. I watched her carefully from behind a tree. She looked as beautiful and gentle as I remembered. She had already passed away by then, so whether in dreams or memories, she always looked the same. When I was abroad, I struggled to learn new things while receiving treatment for depression from a doctor. Being in a foreign land, the only comfort I had was my mom visiting me in my dreams each night. But the doctor said this showed I hadn't truly let go. These painful memories should gradually fade over time, including my mom's face and voice. But she was my mom. Even though it hurt to think of her, I was still willing to cling to those painful memories, replaying her gentle face in my dreams over and over. The more I remember her, the less I can forgive them. My father still hasn't learned anything about the baby's father from me. He looks angry and helpless, and there's even a hint of pity in his eyes when he looks at me. I was his beloved daughter, at least I used to be. The daughter who once sat on his shoulders, now reduced to an unmarried girl with an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. I don't know how much pain he feels, but it surely can't compare to the pain of losing my mom, and then watching him bring Miranda and her child into our home. My father has started secretly investigating everything about my time abroad. I was prepared for this long ago. I know all about their current actions, including Quentin's frantic search for the man who fathered this child. This is exactly what I wanted to see. Everything is going according to plan. While I'm seeing a doctor to ensure a safe pregnancy, I'm also starting to gradually take over the family business. The company was founded by my grandparents, and after they passed, it became something they left behind for my mom. Now it's my mom's legacy to me. If Miranda dares to touch this legacy, I'll make sure she pays with interest for everything. I've already reached out to the old employees who were close to my mom. Even though they've been suppressed by Miranda in various ways over the past 5 years, they haven't lost a single share. All Miranda's efforts over the last 5 years have only resulted in Quentin gradually buying up scattered shares. As for the shares my mom left behind, they're still legally my father's. That's what my mom left for me, and my father doesn't dare touch them. No wonder Miranda is willing to take the risk of having a child at her age. She really doesn't have time to waste. After I returned, Miranda immediately contacted her people in the company to speed up the acquisition of shares and secretly transfer funds. As soon as she makes a move, I can have her locked up. Unfortunately for her, all these plans ended up on Quentin's desk. I ran my fingers over the words on the document, narrowing my eyes slightly. In all the years Quentin has been with the company, he hasn't made any underhanded moves. Everything is clean, from the accounts to the business itself, as if he's been waiting for me to come back. I closed the file, unwilling to think about it any further. Chess must be played step by step, and the first piece to capture is Jenna. 5 years ago, she not only took my place, but she also suggested to my parents that they report me missing. In front of everyone, she pretended to accidentally let it slip. Holly wouldn't have gone off with her boyfriend, would she? I think I saw her with a guy last time. Rumors spread like wildfire, touching every corner. And in the end, the truth didn't disappoint them. I was indeed the girl who went out overnight with her boyfriend, disappeared, and caused her parents to call the police. Jenna is now the face of a dance company, and there have been a lot of entertainment news reports about her recently, hinting at her moving into the entertainment industry. It seems that since that competition, her life has been smooth sailing. She's not only become a young lady, but now she also wants to be a star. I won't let you have your way. I took a sip of milk and gently rubbed my belly. This child might be a threat to Miranda, but for Jenna, it's the perfect tool to disgrace me. In a few days, it will be the alumni gathering at our old school. Jenna will probably deliver the invitation to me herself. 7. Holly, you're coming to the alumni gathering tonight, right? Jenna smiled sweetly as she placed the gilded red invitation in front of me. Everyone's been really curious about you these past 5 years while you were abroad. People often ask me about you. I looked up at her, and she covered her mouth as she laughed. Oh, by the way, I transferred to your alma mater before the college entrance exams. The principal personally invited me since there's only one spot available in the whole city for guaranteed admission. That's true, I replied calmly. Bowen High School is always ranked first in the city for its university acceptance rate. It's rare for students to enter college through guaranteed admission. Jenna's expression changed. But that's still better than someone who failed the exams and had to leave the country in disgrace. I don't think Bowen's ever had someone who didn't even meet the cutoff for a bachelor's degree. I smiled faintly without responding. Jenna seemed pleased with herself, but when she noticed I wasn't reacting, she grew anxious. Her goal was to get me to attend the reunion. After all, what could be more humiliating than a failure like me attending a prestigious school's alumni gathering? And to add insult to injury, my mother had also been an outstanding alumna there. Jenna, seeing that her words had no effect on me, huffed and walked away. I stared at the red invitation on the table. My mother used to receive this same invitation, and sometimes she would take me along. I'd sit on her lap, surrounded by uncles and aunts who would gently pat my head, taking turns to hug and kiss me. I pressed my hand against my forehead, telling myself not to think about it anymore. Just now, I had seen my mother's figure standing at the table, smiling at me like she always did. The hallucinations were starting to seep from my dreams into reality, clinging to me, damp and suffocating, wrapping around my stiff body. I struggled to maintain my composure, closing my eyes tightly. If I let myself relax even a little, I would see my mother's familiar figure, standing in every corner of the house, smiling at me with that same gentle expression. I wasn't afraid of my mother, nor did I fear ghosts. I just missed her too much. Seeing her in my dreams had already caused my longing to spiral out of control. If I saw her in reality, I feared I might drown in it. A sharp pain in my abdomen snapped me back to reality. I opened my eyes suddenly, and the house was empty. Panting slightly, I placed the cup down and cradled my abdomen. It felt as if the child inside me had just pulled me back. I forced myself to stand. My yearning for my mother drained me of all my strength, but the hatred I harbored for those people was what allowed me to keep going. Ironic, yet motivational. Tonight, it's time for Jenna to pay for the last 5 years of my life. When Jenna saw me standing at the hotel entrance, stepping out of my father's car, she was visibly shocked. My father, on the other hand, looked panicked and anxious, quickly grabbing my hand to explain. "Holly, I didn't know you were coming. Jenna said she was afraid to take a taxi by herself, so I drove her here. Why didn't you tell me you wanted to come?" I gently withdrew my hand. I had thought I wouldn't care, but seeing my father personally drive Miranda's daughter here made me feel uncomfortable. If my mother were alive, how would she feel? "Because I hate her," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but I smiled brightly. "I hate her so much I could die." My father flinched when he heard the word die, his pupils contracting. He opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. By now, a crowd had started to gather, but I had more important matters to attend to tonight and didn't want to be the center of attention here. I smiled at my father, lifted the hem of my dress, and walked into the hotel. The sound of high heels clattered quickly behind me as Jenna hurried to catch up. She haughtily brushed back her hair, throwing me a smug glance. "If you wanted to come, Holly, you could have just said so. I would have asked Dad to bring you along too. I didn't want people to think I'm associated with you." "But we are related," Jenna said, leaning in with a playful tone. "Sister? Or should I call you sister-in-law?" My steps faltered. "You two siblings are just alike. Equally disgusting." As we reached the door of the gathering room, I stepped forward to push it open, then turned to Jenna, who now had a livid expression. I smiled sweetly. "After you. Let's see you humiliated here, Jenna." 8. I stood beside the drinks table, the alumni gathering taking place 5 years after graduation. There were no familiar faces of the uncles and aunts who had been friends with my mother, only strangers whose knowledge of me was limited to rumors and gossip. I slowly swirled the champagne in my glass, though I couldn't drink it because of the pregnancy. I tried my best not to appear bored. Jenna, surrounded by alumni, was the center of attention, but she quickly noticed me standing alone in the corner. Her eyes gleamed with mischief as she waved the group over to me. "Holly, everyone wanted to meet you, so I brought them over." Jenna turned around gracefully and introduced me to the others. "This is my sister, Holly. Back in the day, she was the most famous person at our high school." Jenna was eager to embarrass me, not realizing that as she prattled on, the others were starting to look uncomfortable. Some even appeared a bit uneasy. Indeed, I had been the laughingstock of the entire school back then. But no one could ignore my background, or how I looked today in my black off-shoulder, body-hugging mermaid gown. My long curly hair was loosely pinned up, with a few strands cascading over my exposed collarbone. I noticed several men's heated gazes on my skin as they awkwardly held their drinks, listening to Jenna recount old tales. Idle gossip among the young and impulsive may seem fierce at the time, but it rarely holds up under the scrutiny of adulthood. Slander is easy when the subject isn't present, growing more malicious with each retelling, but who dares speak such things to someone's face? Jenna rambled on for a while, and when she realized no one was reacting, she stopped awkwardly, directing her words at me instead. "Sis, why don't you say something?" I gently set down my champagne glass and looked at everyone across from me. "I don't know any of you. Could you leave me alone?" Everyone's expressions changed. Jenna hadn't expected me to be so blunt. She looked at me with a mix of embarrassment and amusement before finally managing to speak. "Holly, I invited you here. If you talk like this, it puts me in an awkward position. Who said you invited me?" Before Jenna could respond, there was a commotion outside. People began cheering, and the clinking of glasses filled the air. The principal of Bowen High School, dressed in an old suit but still full of energy, walked in and immediately spotted me. "Holly, you've really returned." The principal's face lit up as he walked over to me, carefully looking me over, his small eyes welling up with tears. "You look more and more like your mother, exactly like her." My mother had been the principal's prized student, and he had often held me as a child, showering me with affection. He was my mother's favorite too. At my mother's funeral, it was this principal who, with red eyes, replaced my late grandfather and slapped my father hard across the face. "Grandpa James," I said, taking his hand. Seeing him reminded me of my mother. "The people remain, but the deceased are gone." "Yes, it's really good to see you." Grandpa James patted my hand, his voice choked with emotion. "You've grown into a fine young lady. And you're still as spry as ever," I said with a smile. "I brought several bottles of your favorite wine from abroad, just waiting for the chance to give them to you." The principal nearly burst into tears. My mother used to have people bring his favorite wine from overseas every year, but he hadn't tasted that familiar flavor in 5 years. Even if it was the same wine, it wouldn't taste the same if it wasn't gifted by his most cherished student. "What are you all doing here?" Grandpa James asked, noticing the group gathered around me. His frown was stern, commanding respect without even trying. "Why are all of you crowding around Holly? Don't you have anything else to do?" Peeper and Sippa. Even though they had graduated, they immediately lowered their heads at the sight of him. "Jenna brought us here," one of them stammered. "She was telling us about Holly." Grandpa James's face darkened. 5 years ago I lost my mother, and he lost his most treasured student. He understood Jenna's intentions immediately and lost his temper. "Is gossiping about others the only thing you can do? Do you even have any self-respect? Talking behind someone's back. And you still dare to call yourselves Bowen students?" All eyes turned towards us. Jenna's face turned ashen, her hand trembling slightly as she held her wine glass, unable to lift her head. Grandpa James's scolding was just the appetizer, causing Jenna to be embarrassed and humiliated. The main course was still to come. "Grandpa James, please don't be angry. You should go and join the uncles and aunts." I coaxed him gently. "There are a lot of young people here, and they're just chatting about unimportant things. Don't let it get to you." "Holly, you should come with me," Grandpa James said, glaring at Jenna. "No need to stay here and put up with this nonsense." "I can't, Grandpa James. You're the one who said the alumni from different years shouldn't mingle." I looked at him with feigned difficulty. The rule was meant to prevent younger people from trying to climb the social ladder through older alumni. If I joined him, it would only lead to more gossip. "Then bring everyone else over here." Grandpa James quickly caught on to my intentions, turning back to hold my hand warmly. "Holly, let's have a good chat later. Your uncles and aunts have missed you so much while you've been abroad." I nodded repeatedly, glancing at Jenna with a smile. Jenna's eyes were full of resentment as she looked at me, but I only smiled more serenely. It was important for her to feel this resentment, as it would lead to the reaction I was aiming for. The uncles and aunts soon gathered around, surrounding me as they had in the past, looking me up and down. Some of the aunts were so emotional that they had tears in their eyes, repeating the same thing over and over. "You look so much like your mother." As I stood there, comforting the crying aunts with a smile, I instinctively searched the crowd for tonight's main course, and spotted Quentin's father. Uncle Jennings, who had been childhood friends with my mother, had seen Miranda marry into the Gu family and then, after my mother's death, watched as she married my father. He and Aunt Harper, whom he married later, were deeply remorseful about what happened. Uncle Jennings stood at a distance watching me. His features bore a striking resemblance to Quentin's, only more severe and aloof. I nodded at him and he seemed surprised, quickly raising his glass in acknowledgement. I then spotted the person I had been looking for. My former dance instructor. A few years ago, she had even come abroad to persuade me not to give up, but after seeing my condition, she had been heartbroken and abandoned the idea of putting me back on stage. Jenna noticed the instructor too, and her face instantly lost all color. "Jenna, 5 years ago, you took my place in the dance audition and volunteered to join this instructor's dance troupe. But when she didn't value you as much, you secretly reported her. You filed an anonymous complaint, pretending to be both the victim and the whistleblower." which tarnished her reputation and cost her a chance to compete internationally. Forcing a smile, Jenna began approaching the instructor with her wine glass, ready to greet her. Of course, back then, the instructor didn't know that you were the one who filed the complaint. She only knew you as the unjustly accused victim, so why would she blame you? After the crisp sound of a slap, the shattering of a wine glass reverberated through the room, and a hush fell over the crowd. But you see, I had already handed over all the evidence of your betrayal to this instructor, including the documents clearly showing that you were the one who reported her. I watched with satisfaction as Jenna stood in the center of the room, bewildered and helpless, while the surrounding crowd slowly formed a circle around her. Facing her was the instructor, her anger unmistakable. This instructor had come specifically to settle the score with you. Sister. The anger of the teacher exceeded my expectations. Jenna was scolded to tears, but no one dared to comfort her. As Jenna tried to retort, the evidence I had sent to the teacher was thrown in her face. Principal James stood protectively behind me, and I watched Jenna lose face in front of everyone. She had once made me a laughingstock at school, and now she was publicly humiliated at such a grand event. By the time the news spread, she would likely lose her place in the dance troupe as well. Jenna clutched the papers on the floor, her gaze fixed on me with intense resentment. Startled by her hateful look, I quietly said goodbye to Principal James and prepared to leave. However, Jenna suddenly pushed through the crowd and grabbed my wrist tightly. Holly. Jenna was trembling with anger, her words sharp and unfiltered. Pregnant out of wedlock. You're the one without shame. I brought you here to make sure you weren't like your mother who jumped off a building. How could you do this to me? I will never degrade myself like that. Jenna yelled hoarsely. Having a child with a drug dealer. Shut up. Another sharp slap rang out. Quentin, furious, glared at Jenna, his eyes almost murderous. He had apparently come running, his chest heaving with anger, and his eyes radiated a desire to kill Jenna. Bastard! I had never heard Quentin curse before. He was trembling with rage, pointing at Jenna and yelling, "Isn't it enough to make a fool of yourself outside? Stop making a scene here." I realized Quentin had found out the truth, though I hadn't expected Jenna to know as well. No wonder she had been so eager to invite me. As the siblings' quarrel intensified, I prepared to leave. But before I could, someone else grabbed my wrist. Holly, you really know how to attract trouble. I turned around in surprise. Hunter Jennings, what are you doing here? Hunter, with features similar to Quentin's, looked at me with frustration. You come back to the country and don't even tell me. I flew over to find you, then rushed back in a panic. I was worried about you. Jennings' uncle, noticing his second son among the crowd, looked very displeased. Hunter, what are you doing here? Hunter tightened his grip on my hand. We're leaving. I had already planned to leave, but being taken away by Hunter was another matter entirely. I immediately tried to pull away, but Hunter, always unpredictable, had anticipated my move. He bent down and picked me up, carrying me in a bridal carry. You bastard! Held tightly by Hunter, I was too afraid to look at Jennings' uncle's face, clenching my teeth and pinching Hunter's arm. Hunter! I heard Quentin's astonished shout behind me. The situation was completely out of my control. 3 years ago, when Hunter first met me in the US, I had decided to keep my distance. My emotional state was terrible, and I often dreamt of my fabricated scenario where my mother jumped from a building. My emotions were unstable, and I relied on medication to maintain temporary calmness. At that time, Aunt Harper had moved to the US to stay with me, and Hunter, with his unruly personality, was also brought along to avoid trouble. While I appreciated Aunt Harper's kindness, I couldn't bring myself to be friendly with Hunter, knowing he was Quentin's half-brother. We didn't speak for 3 days until the 4th day. That afternoon, my emotions uncontrollably spiraled. I locked myself in a room and hid in the closet, trembling. Despite Aunt Harper's knocking, I didn't open the door until Hunter broke it open with a knife and pulled me out of the dark closet. At 19, Hunter was young and vigorous, resembling Quentin. His presence scared me, bringing back memories of my father's scolding and my mother's smile. Hunter's warm palms held my wrists firmly as he carried me out and pressed on my injured wrists, helping me into an ambulance amidst the frantic voices of others. Since then, Hunter had been persistently attached to me. But I didn't like him. I wanted to push him away. Unfortunately, his persistence meant he never left. Eventually, I stopped trying to chase him away, knowing he would eventually go away once he went to college. I never expected him to fly to the US during every holiday, especially when I didn't want to return home. He would eagerly come to visit me, squeezing into my tiny apartment. I once asked him, "Does Quentin not know you come here?" It was the first time I mentioned Quentin to Hunter, who was lounging on my small sofa in casual clothes, his feet propped up. "He isn't close with our family." "Oh," I replied quietly. I remembered Quentin standing by the window, earnestly telling me he wanted a normal family with loving parents and a sweet sister. He had a brother but never mentioned him, suggesting that Quentin was more focused on his biological mother. For him, having his biological mother was the most essential part of his ideal family. His wish came true, and for his mother, no husband was more suitable than her first love. Holly. Hunter's voice woke me from my daze. I realized I had been rubbing the same spot on the table for a long time, the smooth surface reflecting my pale, exhausted face. It was no wonder I couldn't clean it. Tears had been falling continuously. Fearing Hunter would hear my crying, I merely responded quietly. Hunter remained silent for a while before asking, "Did Quentin really date you?" I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Hunter sat up, his cat-like eyes fixed on me. "Everyone says you liked him and missed the selection because you wanted to spend another day with him." "Who said that?" I asked, struggling to breathe. Hunter's silence confirmed my guess. Even if he hadn't said it, Quentin hadn't clarified it, meaning he accepted the rumor. I leaned on the table, breathless, as Hunter hurried to support me. I was shaking violently, my vision blurring. If Quentin admitted to dating me, how could my father justify marrying his mother? I clung to Hunter's hand, crying uncontrollably, shaking all over. It was him who called me out. He drugged me, but the blood test didn't show it. I have no evidence. I cried into Hunter's chest, my tears mixing with my sobs. I can't accuse him. Mom promised to be with me, but she's gone. Why? What did I do to deserve this? I raged at Hunter for a long time. Eventually, a doctor arrived and gave me a sedative, leading me into a deep sleep. At that moment, I realized it wasn't that I couldn't let go of Quentin or escape the past shadows. It was that my mother had died because of me. I would hate Quentin, his family, and myself for the rest of my life. Lost in despair, I felt as if I was at the bottom of an abyss. I couldn't climb out or escape. That day, I raged for a long time, and Hunter held me carefully. Even though I beat and bit him, he never let go, gently stroking my trembling back. Hunter liked me, but I didn't like him because he was Quentin's brother. Hunter carried me out of the hotel and put me in the passenger seat of the car. As soon as the car stopped, I instinctively tried to get out, but Hunter blocked the door and silently leaned in to fasten my seatbelt. No, he didn't just fasten it. He tied it into a tight knot. "Holly, are you crazy?" I tugged at the knot with all my strength. The seatbelt was pulled tight and secured with a buckle. Hunter said nothing as he got into the car, fastened his own seatbelt, and turned the key. "Hunter!" I heard Quentin's voice from behind. Turning my head, I saw Quentin anxiously running out of the hotel. Our eyes met through the rearview mirror. "He's coming." The engine roared to life, but Hunter remained calm. "Do you want to get out?" Clutching the seatbelt, I glared at him and gritted out 2 words. "Drive." "Understood." Hunter instantly smiled. As Quentin pushed through the crowd toward us, Hunter floored the accelerator, speeding away with me in tow. I stared blankly out the window, watching the skyscrapers blur by. The city lights in the night merged into a line with the sound of the wind outside, shimmering and swirling. This wasn't part of my plan. I wanted Quentin and Jenna to clash once they learned the identity of the baby's father, to make Jenna lose Quentin's protection and reveal her true self. But Hunter's abrupt intervention had disrupted my plans. "Your dad saw you." I turned to look at the scenery, avoiding looking at Hunter. Hunter was 2 years younger than Quentin, and a 21-year-old boy in a rage was truly exasperating. "I saw him too," Hunter said, laughing as he recalled Jennings' uncle's expression. He looked like he was about to crush his wine glass. Jennings' uncle won't want you near me. I closed my eyes, not wanting to be caught in this awkward situation between brothers. Besides, I was here for revenge, not to find another man, especially not my ex's brother. When I was a kid, my dad took me to an exhibition. I fell in love with an antique vase, but it wasn't the kind of thing adults buy for kids. Hunter's voice was mixed with the sound of the wind through the car window. My dad wouldn't let me get close. He said if I touched it, he'd break my legs. But I still broke the vase. My dad's expression was just like it was earlier, almost the same. And then, I thought to myself that if he had been broken, he'd have learned his lesson. Then my dad had to pay to replace the broken vase and broke one of my legs when we got home. Hunter chuckled. You know, no pain, no gain. After healing, I grew taller quickly. Otherwise, how could I be taller than Quentin? Are you unhappy with your height now? I finally turned to face Hunter. The window was slightly open, and the cold wind rushed in, making my hair fly wildly. You're so close to me. Aren't you afraid your dad will break your other leg? Hunter gave me a sidelong glance, his smile sharp as a knife, his voice shifting from light to heavy. In the confined space of the car, I could hear it all too clearly. I'll be careful, trying not to break you. I turned and grabbed the door handle. Stop the car. I want to go back. Not stopping. Hunter was unfazed by my threat, calmly saying, sit tight and if you're brave, jump out. Where are you taking me? A hint of fear crept into my mind. Hunter's serious expression earlier made me worry that he might actually take me somewhere and lock me up. To the maternity hospital, of course. Hunter pounded the steering wheel. Have you had an exam since you got back? You're still wearing. Your stomach is being squeezed. I thought you were just gaining weight. I wore this deliberately. What if the baby inside is getting squeezed? What if you choke the baby's neck? Hunter, a 2-month-old baby doesn't have a neck. I know, but it would be uncomfortable for the baby. A baby who doesn't even know if it's a boy or girl can't possibly feel discomfort. My phone in my handbag rang. It was a call from Quentin. I didn't want to answer, so I turned off the phone. The argument earlier had dissipated, leaving the car in silence. After a while, I heard Hunter's hoarse voice. I know you don't like me handling this, but for the sake of the baby, let me at least try to help. Hunter signaled and turned at the next intersection. I watched the trees outside slowly retreat, my head resting against the window, feeling a mix of emotions. Hunter, I don't like you. You've rejected me many times, but this baby? Hunter tried to keep his voice calm, suppressing his emotions. At least he has the Gu surname. I placed my hand on my stomach, a feeling of frustration boiling inside me. Jennings' uncle is a good man, and Aunt Harper is also kind. Hunter. Although he's annoying, I know he means well. But my quest for revenge is painful, filled with a muddy resentment. I don't want to drag Hunter into this mess. Aunt Harper is gentle and kind. She came to the U.S. to take care of me in place of my mother several times. Hunter has a good mother, and I don't want to make Aunt Harper sad. Hunter, my voice trembled slightly. Looking at the speeding scenery outside, my thoughts and words gradually separated. Each word spoken felt incredibly cruel. If I had even the slightest bit of affection for you or liked you in any way, I wouldn't have ended up pregnant with your brother's child, even if it was for revenge. A slight pain in my lower abdomen felt like the baby was kicking me. The car stopped and Hunter quietly braked. I knew I had hurt his feelings deeply. I slowly untied the knot in the seatbelt. If Hunter could also resolve his inner conflict, at least he could live without grudges in the future. With the knot undone, I reached for the car door handle, apologetically whispering, Hunter, thank you. No need to thank me. Hunter neatly parked, turned off the engine and took out the keys. He opened the car door and got out. I looked up at him, following his pointed finger. A new maternity hospital. We're here. Hunter closed the car door, calmly walked to my side and opened the door for me. I numbly followed him, watching as he held the door open, looking down at me with casual indifference. Go in and get checked. Under Hunter's watch, I numbly allowed the doctor to examine me. The conclusion was the same as what I heard abroad. Miss Baxter, your mental state directly affects your body. Your current mental state is not suitable for keeping this baby, the female doctor said calmly. Your body is very weak. It's best to rest and take care of yourself first. You can think about the baby later. The exact same words. I touched my stomach. Even though I viewed it as a tool for revenge against Quentin, hearing that it was still being denied existence caused my heart to ache. On the way home with Hunter, the ride was silent. It wasn't until we reached the Baxter house that he spoke his first words. Do you want me to take you inside? No need. I unfastened my seatbelt, opened the car door and got out. Thank you. We were both silent about the situation with the baby. Holly, if you want to keep this baby, I can take you away. Hunter had mentioned this more than once since learning about my pregnancy. I still hope you can move on from the past.
Impossible.
I looked up at the outline of my house in the night. Even in the dark, I could clearly see the places my mother and I had walked through together. Her presence was everywhere. My longing for her was all-consuming. Entering the hall, the first thing I saw was my father sitting on the sofa with a grim face. Miranda, with her hand on her belly, was trying to comfort him, but her lips were curled up in an uncontrollable smile. Quentin sat at the end of the sofa and was the first to see me. He jumped up, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. I turned my head and noticed Jenna's absence. It seemed the shock of the night had affected her quite a bit. Come here. What kind of child are you carrying? My father's eyes were bloodshot with rage. A drug dealer, a thug stabbed to death in an alley in America. How could you be carrying a child of such a person? His gaze was filled with disbelief, pain, disappointment, and anger. Maybe it's because... I stretched out my words, smiling sweetly. Because he's American, and I wanted a mixed-race baby. Slap! It was the first time my father hit me. The pain on my cheek was searing. I staggered but managed to stay on my feet. In my peripheral vision, I saw Quentin, shocked, trying to come to my aid, only to be restrained by Miranda, who held him back. How could you? Tears welled up in my father's eyes as he clenched his fists, looking at me with anguish. How did it come to this? Do you think having this baby will make you happy? Will this child be happy? Just like you and Mom? My retort struck a nerve with my father. His face went pale and he stared at me, unable to speak. Maybe after I give birth, I'll feel like jumping off a building. Then when I die, the man I married might remarry within 6 months of my death. I might haunt the house, staring at them endlessly. My cheek was already red and swollen. I looked at Miranda's fearful face and began to smile. Do you hate me, Dad? I asked as tears streamed down his face. Yes, of course I hate you, but this isn't the time to say it. Dad loves you. Dad loves you more than anyone else in the world. He tried desperately to assure me. Yes, you love me, so you've kept the truth about Mom's death hidden all this time. I took a few steps forward and gently grasped my father's hand. I don't hate you. I just pity Mom. If Mom were here, how would she feel about us, Dad? My father's face twisted in pain, and behind him Miranda looked even more displeased. I poured oil on the fire. Dad, Mom saw you marry someone else, watched other people's children take over my home, my memories, my family. What would Mom think? No one will take away what's yours. My father grabbed my shoulders fiercely, his voice hoarse. I will always be your dad. I won't let anyone take away what your mom left you. He hugged me tightly. You will always be my beloved daughter. This will always be your home, and your mom's home. Miranda glared at me with malice. My gaze shifted from my father's shoulder to her belly, then slowly up to meet her eyes. I slowly smiled. Miranda's eyes widened in shock as she glared at me with gritted teeth. But the baby's father is still not a good person. Miranda forced a kind smile. While the pregnancy is still early, it's best to terminate it. A girl in her 20s getting pregnant out of wedlock, and with the father's identity exposed later, what will Holly do? Cannot terminate it. Quentin suddenly stood up, his voice so loud that even his own mother was startled. This baby is what she wants to keep. Quentin's eyes were red, his gaze fearful, each word seeming like a test. It's Holly who wants to keep it. It seemed Quentin clearly understood now. This was his child. Although Hunter had stirred up trouble, my plan was still proceeding smoothly. Jenna was sent to stay at a hotel by my father. After all, she was the one who spread the news of my pregnancy. No matter how many times she called him Dad over the past 5 years, it was useless. Blood ties ultimately make a difference. Miranda couldn't plead her case. In fact, due to my comments tonight, my father had developed a resistance towards her. Miranda looked at me with a burning hatred. I touched my stomach, wondering if using this child to get revenge on everyone would finally mean I won. Late into the night, my father found me in Mom's study. I was flipping through Mom's photo albums. The smiles in the photos were so familiar but were no longer visible. I miss your mom too. My father stood behind me and took a sketchbook from the shelf. I had never seen this sketchbook in Mom's study before. Hesitantly, I glanced at my father, took it, and opened it. Inside were sketches. Sketches of me and Mom. The drawings captured our daily interactions. Whenever Mom played with me, Dad used to sit quietly on the side and watch. Turns out he was drawing at that time. Your mother and I did not marry out of love, my father said, gazing around the study with a nostalgic look. Back then, I was just a poor student in the design field, unworthy of your mother's family. Later, I wanted to go into politics, but due to your grandfather's business connections, I had to withdraw. Now, I'm just a small designer. So, is that why you've always resented Mom? I don't resent your mother. So much happened back then, he said, pressing his forehead with his hand. It has nothing to do with you. It's something from over 20 years ago. Ultimately, it's our fault, not yours. Your mother's death truly has nothing to do with you. No, it has to do with me. I quietly closed the sketchbook. My father remained unaware that the things he spoke of were the reasons behind Mom's suicide. Her depression might have started back when she married him. I placed the sketchbook back on the shelf. You never told Mom about these things, did you? My father showed a look of guilt and hesitated before speaking. Holly, did you come back with the baby to get revenge on me? Revenge for letting Miranda get pregnant and insulting your mother. Since you married her, you've been insulting Mom. I closed my eyes, struggling to control my trembling and anger. Without thinking, I blurted out, if one day I also jump off a building, it will definitely be because of you. Holly. The pain in my father's eyes was unmistakable. He looked much older, his spirit waning as he stared at me. After your mother passed away, you were all I had. And you have a new family, a new wife, and an unborn son. I was exhausted from this conversation and turned to leave, but my father called out to me. What do you think of Quentin? I turned around sharply, shocked by the unexpected question. Though he lives here, his household registration isn't here. Even though I married his mother, he isn't related to you by blood, and legally it's allowed for us to marry. He's a responsible young man, and it's clear he has feelings for you. My father looked at me with hope. And don't you like him? He will definitely care for your child. Shut up. I slammed the desk lamp on the ground with force, panting heavily as I watched my father's stunned face. Don't think everyone is like you, thinking that only being with your first love makes it complete. I'm disgusted by him. Disgusted by Jenna. Disgusted by all of you. My anger was overwhelming, making me dizzy. My stomach began to cramp, but the intense rage fueled me, giving me the strength to keep my balance. Marry him? I'd rather marry that thug who died in the American street. I spat out the words through gritted teeth and yanked open the study door with all my strength. Quentin was standing at the door, looking down in silence. I was still catching my breath, and seeing him made me want to pick up the lamp from the floor and hit him with it. As I avoided Quentin and walked back to my room, I heard him asking in pain behind me, Holly, is it really impossible for you to ever forgive me? I stopped and turned back to look at him. It's possible. Let my mom live. Don't just say marry you, even if it means having your child. I took a breath, staring at him with intense focus. Even if it means having your child, I'd do it willingly. Quentin clenched his fists tightly, looking at me with a mix of anguish and something unspoken. How could he possibly tell everyone that I was carrying his child? It was impossible, just like how he dared not tell anyone the nauseating truth that he loved me. How could he reveal it to others or let me know? If I knew the baby in my stomach was his, I would have aborted it without hesitation. Quentin believed this firmly. Seeing his pale, pained expression gave me an unexpected sense of relief. My anger dissipated. I found myself sincerely grateful for what happened 2 months ago. Thanks to that acquaintance I met, the devastating truth that day, and Quentin sneaking back to the UDES to bring me back to my room. I even thanked myself for that night when I reached out to wrap my arms around his neck and pressed my lips to his. That night, Quentin brought me back home. Although I was very drunk, I clearly sensed that it was Quentin who was with me. He laid me on the bed, touched my face, and his restrained emotions when he called my name were evident to anyone. I learned that night how Miranda had schemed behind the scenes, using my father and me to drive my mother to her death. Now, what was that woman's son doing here? To insult me while I was drunk? To make me believe I was ruined and then drive me to jump off a building? As Quentin's hand touched my face, my hand secretly reached under the pillow to grasp the dagger I had hidden there. The US is not as safe as my country. Sometimes you can hear muffled gunshots in the night. For self-defense, I kept the dagger hidden under my pillow. At that moment, my anger nearly overwhelmed my rationality. My mind was filled with thoughts of killing Quentin, slicing his throat, stabbing the dagger into his chest, and making Miranda experience the pain of losing a son. As Quentin's breathing approached, I tightened my grip on the dagger. Get closer, just a little closer so I can stab your neck. Quentin drew nearer, his hot breath on my throbbing veins. Blood and alcohol mixed together, challenging my remaining sanity. Closer, closer, let's go to hell together. Quentin's lips were now by my ear, his chest close enough that I could stab his heart directly. I slowly moved my hand from under the pillow, holding the dagger. I'm sorry. Warm liquid fell onto my neck. I'm sorry. Quentin's voice, full of suppressed sobs, whispered apologies into my ear, as if seeking redemption. Why cry? Why apologize? Do you love me? My hand froze. This possibility exploded in my mind. Since the day Quentin betrayed me, I believed he only used me. But he loved me. He actually loved me. I slowly released the grip on the dagger, my arm moving gently around Quentin's back. I could feel him stiffen, his disbelief evident as he murmured in my ear. Holly, are you awake? I looked up at the ceiling, tears streaming down my face as I held Quentin tightly and gently stroked his heated back. Yes, I love you. If you love me, why didn't you stop your mother? Why didn't you stop yourself from bringing me water? If you love me, why didn't you hesitate or show any remorse? If you truly love me. I held Quentin close, my heart pounding like never before. The dark ceiling seemed to ripple, and I saw my desperate mother stagger to the edge of the building, her fragile figure tumbling down like a piece of paper. If you truly loved me, then Mom wouldn't have had to die. I leaned close to Quentin's ear, my breath like orchids, my voice a poisonous snake slithering into his ear and reaching his mind. I love you, Miller. I felt Quentin's body stiffen. I love you, Miller. I love you. I chose the most detestable person to repeatedly whisper his name, expressing my love so intensely that it would surely make him suffer deeply. I'd rather love the worst person in the world, degrade myself, than ever love you. As expected, Quentin began to struggle, trying to escape my embrace, trying to escape my voice. I clung to him passionately, entangled with him, endlessly professing my love for Miller. Feeling Quentin's suffering, for the first time in 5 years I was clear-headed and incredibly exhilarated. Ultimately he succumbed, holding me tightly, tears streaming down his face as he trembled and tangled with me. We were like trapped beasts in our own worlds, seeking liberation from our emotions, but Quentin was a remorseful beast, and I was a crazed one. As long as I could deeply hurt you, what does my own suffering matter? I spent the whole night murmuring Miller's name. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff, sore body. Quentin was gone. Though my body ached, it was clearly cleaned thoroughly. I struggled to get up, dressed, and looked at my disheveled self in the mirror, unable to control my laughter, tears streaming as I laughed. I knew it. I had finally become a madwoman. The next day, news came that Miller was stabbed to death on the street. Evil deeds always come with retribution, as do others. I began preparing my plan to return home and arrange the fate of each person involved. A month later, I discovered I was pregnant. The doctor said my current mental state was unsuitable for having the baby. Everyone advised me to abort. Hunter silently took off his coat and draped it over my shoulders. I was indeed worried that a madman's child might be another madman, but thinking of Quentin's agony that night, I decided to keep the baby. This child, conceived with the deepest hatred from his mother towards his father, would be the perfect tool for revenge against Quentin. When I return home and reveal the news that the child's father is dead, the only deceased person on my side is Miller. It won't be hard to find him. What will Quentin's reaction be when he hears that name? He probably thinks that the person I was entangled with that night was Miller. The next day Miller was dead. So whose child is this? When you realize that, Quentin, won't you feel like thunderstruck, numb all over? You know this is your child, but you can't tell anyone. This pain must be far worse than the night you heard me declare my love for another man. I don't know if this is his child, and he doesn't dare let me know. I looked at the man in front of me, his face contorted in pain and hesitation. His fists were clenched, and his eyes trembled as if the truth would burst out any second, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. So you can only suffer in silence, watching me carry your child, believing it to be another man's. You might even see me happy because of Miller's child. And perhaps I'll meet someone new, bringing your child and mine, happily marrying someone else. If you have nothing more to say, I'll go back to my room. I smiled at him, lovingly touching my abdomen. Holly, you? Quentin couldn't utter any words, only a weak reminder. You need to take care of yourself, and the baby. Thank you, but it has nothing to do with you. I poured more salt into Quentin's wounds, smiling as I bade him farewell and returned to my room. Was Mom feeling the same way when she was pregnant with me? No, it couldn't have been. She must have loved me very much, telling me many stories, singing lullabies, hoping I would grow up healthy and bright. What about this child? What will their future be like? Mom had once seriously talked to me before her suicide, telling me that being with Dad was her own wishful thinking, and later it was self-torture. She didn't want such a tragedy to happen to me. She had once made the same mistakes for the sake of a friend, and after that, she understood it wasn't worth it. In the end, she said that despite the pain, the happiest thing was my birth, which brought her new hope and joy. So, she didn't regret meeting Dad because ultimately I would be her daughter. Who knew that would be the last time I'd say, I love you, Mom? In the end, she said, I'm sorry, I really can't hold on anymore, and jumped off the building. Will I feel happiness from giving birth to this child? Will this child feel happy because I brought them into the world? I closed my eyes, feeling that I was about to break down, even though I hadn't completed my revenge yet. The next day, Miranda's gaze had completely changed. She couldn't help but scrutinize my stomach, her face struggling to maintain a polite smile. It seemed Quentin had told her mother about the real father of the baby in my womb last night, so her expression was a mix of complexity and disgust. Miranda, this is your own grandchild. Are you really going to act against them? Holly, I suppose your father mentioned it to you last night. Have you given it any thought? So it was you who proposed the idea of marrying Quentin. I put down my daily glass of milk, openly showing my disdain. I already replied yesterday. Didn't Dad tell you? Ah. I suddenly realized. Didn't Dad see you between yesterday and today? Holly. Miranda's face changed drastically, looking at me aggressively. Even if you try to sow discord between me and your father now, it won't change the fact that this child is in my womb. No matter how much you dislike it, this is your dad's biological son. And your own younger brother. I wasn't angry at Miranda's provocation. It actually played into my hands. With so many exes, it's not certain if any of them were my dad's. Uncle Jennings has indeed distanced himself from you and started his own family, but I remember you had another ex-husband. It's possible that you still have lingering feelings for him. After all these years, you still hold a grudge against my dad, and rekindling old flames with your ex-husband is not out of the question. I covered my mouth and laughed. Oh, I almost forgot. Your ex-husband was a domestic abuser. Jenna was probably born because he raped her, right? Miranda used to claim that when she reported it to the police. Holly. Miranda suddenly stood up, trembling and pointing at me. You and your mother are the same. Relying on your family's background, you look down on ordinary people like us. Your mother's suicide was her retribution. Miranda clutched her stomach, breathing heavily, and sneered at me. Yes, it was her retribution. Do you know she used to bully me? She couldn't stand me being with her childhood sweetheart, so she hired people to beat me up. You and your mother are the same. Beasts. Only such a vicious woman would give birth to a daughter like you. Yes, that's the truth Dad kept from me. Because of this, he unhesitatingly believed I had bullied Jenna, without listening to my defense, and Mom consequently jumped from the rooftop. But the day before Mom jumped, she had already told me these things. She feared I might follow in her footsteps because of my obsession, not realizing it was her own obsession. You're right. I sat upright on the sofa. What kind of person has what kind of child? So Quentin and Jenna must be the children of people like you. Is that so? Miranda coldly examined my stomach. What about your child? Do you know whose child you're carrying? I pretended not to understand her implication. I heard that it was thanks to you asking my father for help that your abusive ex-husband was wanted and fled abroad. And with my father's assistance, you found a lawyer and ended your marriage with him. Are you sick? Why are you talking about this? Miranda frowned, watching me with suspicion. As the once high society lady now reduced to the wife of an abusive man, she wished she could erase everything from the past. It just crossed my mind. I smiled. But what are you worried about? Since he's escaped to India, he probably won't come back. No one will disturb your peaceful life anymore. Miranda watched me warily as I stood up and walked around her toward the door. Humph, just like your mother, you're also. Miranda's voice abruptly cut off. I didn't need to look back to imagine the shocked, pale expression on her face. I turned to see Miranda staring at me, her face drained of color, her eyes filled with terror. How do you know? Miranda trembled all over, unable to speak clearly. How do you know he went to India? I guess that an abusive man would most likely go to India. After all, they mine diamonds there. These words were illogical, but Miranda wobbled as if she were about to collapse, looking at me with trembling fear. At that moment, Miranda's phone suddenly rang. She was startled, her eyes wide, not daring to touch the phone. Not answering? I gazed at her calmly. It might be another old lover you can't forget. Miranda shot me a furious glance, trembling as she picked up the phone. After glancing at it, she calmed down, coldly showing me the phone with a sneer. The name Jenna was clearly visible. I smiled at her, turned and walked out of the house, letting the butler drive me to a cafe in the city. By 4 p.m, the person I was waiting for finally arrived. He sat in front of me, silent and dejected, his eyes vacant. After a long time, he spoke as if in a trance. You were right. The two of them are in cahoots. Miranda is one thing, but she's my biological daughter. I worked hard to earn money so she could have a good life. The middle-aged man cried a river, his tears and snot mixing as he lamented. They really called the police. I went to India alone to earn money for them. What a hard life I've lived. He banged his forehead heavily on the table, sobbing loudly. 2 months ago, on the day Quentin carried me back from the bar, I encountered him in a trash-filled alley in America. He was our former driver and the ex-husband Miranda had accused. Miranda's accusation wasn't just about domestic violence. She claimed this man had been instructed by my mother to approach and abuse her. The reason why the police only sought this man and didn't mention my mother's involvement was something I discovered after much investigation. It was because Dad had manipulated the situation to cover it up. Was it for Mom's reputation? Or to maintain marital dignity? I don't know, but the most important thing is, he believed it. He believed Miranda's words. Years of marital affection couldn't withstand Miranda's few words. He didn't even ask Mom a single question. The truth was that the murderer had not yet confessed, and he had already sent Mom to the guillotine of trust. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for you and for Miss. The man cried uncontrollably. If I hadn't gone to India as Miranda asked, Miss wouldn't have been wronged. Miranda had cleverly fabricated evidence of abuse, colluded with Jenna to prepare false testimonies, and deceived this man into going to India, where he provided money. In the end, all it took was a photo of my mother giving money to this man. Everything fell into place. In Dad's eyes, the evidence of Mom hiring someone to commit a crime was clear. As long as she secretly hired someone to steal this man's passport and identification abroad, he would be completely isolated and helpless. She wouldn't even need to act herself. A man who couldn't speak the language and had lost his documents, inexplicably wanted, would have no way to seek help at the embassy and would eventually die quietly on some street. But this man had survived, living like a beggar, having stowed away from India to America. Despite being on the brink of starvation, he still hoped to return home and reunite with his wife and daughter. I want you to come back to the country with me to expose Miranda's true nature. You agreed, with the only condition being that you can't harm your daughter. I agreed, as long as you persuade Jenna to leave with you. I took a sip of milk, looking at the man in front of me with some sympathy. You contacted your daughter and she, along with her mother, called the police to arrest you. Have you given up? The man nodded heavily, despairingly. Miss, who wanted to help me, ended up being harmed by me. This is what I owe, miss. It was finally coming to an end. This man's testimony would overturn all of Miranda's previous efforts. Besides making sure they received their comeuppance, I would clear Mom's name from the false crimes and wash away all the mud thrown at her. As I left the cafe, I squinted at the setting sun in the distance, not noticing a car nearby starting slowly before suddenly speeding towards me. The next sound I heard was the man shouting, "Miss, be careful." Then I was forcefully pushed aside, my body thrown several meters and rolling painfully. Sharp pain spread throughout my body, especially in my abdomen, as I saw blood gradually spreading beneath me. My last impression was the crowd's panicked commotion and the cacophony of voices. I barely lifted my head and saw Jenna's pale face in the driver's seat of the car. The first reaction upon opening my eyes was to instinctively touch my belly. It was flat, as if it had never existed. Hunter, beside me, tightly grasped my hand, his face tear-streaked despite his age. I looked at him in confusion, gently pulling my hand back to place it on my stomach again. It was still flat. He's gone. I sighed deeply, my whole body slumping against the headboard. My first child, though not conceived out of love, and whom I hadn't treated well, had been taken away in such a way. Jenna has been taken away, and the man died on the spot. Hunter's voice was weak as he lowered his head. She claimed that after her long-lost father found her, he threatened her for money. When she tried to report him, she couldn't catch him. But when she saw him while driving, she lost control and hit the gas. My voice was calm. Are they accusing me again, saying I found that man and used him to threaten Miranda? After all, I had been there when Jenna hit her own father. The scene was almost identical to when Mom was falsely accused. Miranda was using the same old tricks. Would father too believe it without question like he did 5 years ago? If Quentin comes looking for me, don't stop him. Save the video I sent to your email. I felt exhausted after speaking just 2 sentences. Hunter, silent, helped me lie down and tucked me in. He suddenly placed his hand over my eyes. The warmth of his hand was soothing. I suddenly felt very tired and overwhelmed, tears uncontrollably streaming down my face. It's not your fault about the child. Perhaps the child didn't want to see you suffer so much. Maybe he's trying to prepare a better way to meet you next time. Holly. Hunter leaned closer, gripping my shoulders. This isn't your fault. Don't make yourself suffer more. Mom had once said this to me. She said, Holly, it's not your fault. It has nothing to do with you. It's Mom's fault. In the end, she left me with just one line. I'm sorry, I really can't hold on any longer. I bit my lip hard, but the tears kept flowing. Hunter felt my distress, his grip on my shoulders trembling. Holly, if you're really hurting so much, if they were all dead, would you feel better? I looked at Hunter, who, despite being just a 21-year-old, spoke with a tone filled with hatred. Hunter, if you became a murderer because of me. My voice was harsh. If my actions led you to commit a crime and hurt your mother and Harper aunt, I would never forgive you. This is my business. You don't need to interfere. Holly. Hunter's expression was too painful to bear. I softened my tone. At least promise me you won't do anything foolish. Nothing is more important than your own life. And nothing is more important than keeping Mom from crying. Do-me a favor. Partly to divert Hunter's attention, partly for my own sake. I managed a weak smile, my voice choked. Help that child burn some clothes and toys so she can have a better time down there. You can write her name as. Write Avery. My relationship with this child, though fleeting, would never come to fruition. The first person to visit me was actually Father. Seeing his aged, emaciated face, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, without a shred of guilt or pity. They say you instructed that man to threaten Jenna and the others. Father looked at me with a mix of pity and hope. My Holly wouldn't do such a thing, right? I looked at him calmly. Yes, it was me. I contacted that man and told him Jenna's contact information. Is it wrong to help a father find his biological daughter? That man was a fugitive. Father looked at me in disbelief, trembling with anger. How could you do such a thing? Look at what's become of you. You're practically. Father's voice abruptly stopped. Seeing him panting and unable to finish his sentence was almost amusing, so I really did laugh in front of him. Just like Mom, right? Father's pupils constricted. He trembled, struggling to speak. Holly, how do you know? Your new wife told me herself. She said I'm a beast. My voice should have been pleasant to hear, but Father's face grew paler, tears welling up in his eyes. Holly, you still hate me, don't you? Yes. I answered sharply. I hate you to death. Holly. Father looked pained, clutching his chest as he coughed, his gaze filled with disappointment. How did you become like this? I kept defending you, saying my daughter could never do such things. But you. Tears streamed down his face as he spoke. If you had said the same things to Mom 5 years ago, maybe she wouldn't have jumped off the building. I rubbed my neck, looking coldly at my biological father. I know when Miranda accused Mom, you called her enraged to defend your first love. I mimicked making a phone call, placing my hand by my ear, and smiled at the stunned father. You're such a vicious woman. You actually repeated the mistakes of 20 years ago. Can't you let Miranda go? What did she ever do to wrong you? Your actions are more disgusting than your character. Don't say any more. How far do you want to push Miranda before you're satisfied? Do you have to drive her to death? I thought after 20 years you'd repent, but you're as unchangeable as ever. Stop talking. Father wept, collapsing on his knees beside my bed, clutching his head. Stop talking. Stop talking. I smiled slightly, perfectly mimicking the tone of Father's last words. No wonder Holly now bullies others. It's all your fault. Do you want to turn our daughter into someone like you? The call ended and Mom jumped from the rooftop. As she leaped into the abyss, Father was probably gently comforting the crying Miranda. At that time, even if you had asked Mom one more question, or like just now, if you had said you trusted her and believed she wouldn't do such a thing, Mom might not have collapsed and jumped. But Miranda has evidence. She filmed it. She saw your mother giving that man money. Father's voice grew fainter, trembling more and more. In the silent hospital room, I sat on the bed laughing. Just like now, a vicious woman gives birth to a similarly vicious daughter. Holly. Father tried to lunge at me, but I quickly grabbed a vase from the nearby table and swung it violently at the edge of the bed. The shattering sound startled Father, causing him to stop in fear. The splashed water soaked the sheets and dampened my hospital gown. I gripped the neck of the broken vase tightly. The sharp fragments looked dangerously pointy. The doctors and nurses would arrive soon. I needed to finish this quickly. This final act should not be in this room. I held the broken vase fragments towards Father. The 4 had fallen from my hand due to the vigorous movement, and blood oozed from tiny wounds. Although the wounds were small, the steady trickle quickly stained the sheets red. Shaking slightly, I struggled to maintain a smile. You and Mom both loved me, so you thought you were doing what was best for me by hiding this from me. It took me a long time to find that recording from back then, listening day and night to how my father drove my mother to despair. We had no idea how severe Mom's depression was at that time. She loved me so much, and you included me in the words attacking Mom. How could she not collapse? I tore at the scar that had never healed over the past 5 years, almost laughing through my tears. You drove Mom to the rooftop with a knife, but I was that knife. If I hadn't bullied Jenna back then, if I had just endured, I wouldn't have committed such mistakes or been considered a weapon against her. Holly. Father, in tears, repeatedly called my name. Holly, it was my fault. I'm sorry for what I did to you and to Mom. It was my mistake. I couldn't understand how, after all these years, Mom wasn't worth a shred of genuine trust. He is my biological father. He raised me, quietly bought me sweets, let me sit on his shoulders, treating me like his most precious treasure. I stared at him. The middle-aged man before me was old and haggard, tears streaming down his face, while my memories of Dad were of a refined gentleman who always smiled warmly at me. Holly, you're Daddy's little princess. Daddy will always love you, always protect you. I was so foolish. How did I not notice back then that he never mentioned Mom's name? I watched silently as Father wept before me, moving the vase fragments to my neck and gently pressing them against my vulnerable skin. Like a handgun with a chambered bullet, the cold muzzle was now pressed against my temple. Holly. Father knelt at my bedside, his eyes wide with terror, begging me. It was my fault. It was my fault. Please don't hurt yourself. Daddy would rather die. He slammed his head on the floor, his anguished cries tearing at my heart. I'll apologize at Mom's grave. Please, Daddy loves you the most. I can't lose you, Holly. Looking at Father's fearful, humble figure, my eyes couldn't help but turn red. Why did those who claimed to love me see me only as a weapon that harmed Mom? Doctors and nurses finally arrived. They screamed in shock when they saw me with the broken vase. I sighed with relief, feeling all my strength drain away instantly, letting go of the vase, which shattered completely on the floor. Seeing that I had surrendered, the nurses and doctors cautiously approached, pinning me to the bed, fearing any further actions, and then dragged the kneeling Father out. Father extended his hand to me, tears and guilt in his eyes, calling out, Holly. I had lost my strength, allowing the nurses to bind my hands to the bed rails while they prepared to administer a sedative. The ceiling swayed in front of me. I thought of those years abroad when doctors and nurses often restrained me, because I had mental health issues. I had been given many sedatives, but every time I thought of Mom, the pain was unbearable. Daddy! Before Father was taken out, I suddenly called out to him. Although I couldn't lift my head, I heard his surprised, hopeful voice. Holly, I'm here. Daddy's here. Don't die. I stared at the ceiling, tears streaming down my face but smiling happily. Mom wouldn't want to see you. On Father's side, there was silence. He was likely as exhausted as I was, being dragged out of the ward. Feeling the cold drug being injected into my body, I waited quietly for it to take effect, hearing the desperate cries outside. Please save my daughter. Please save her. Sir, please leave. The patient's emotions are very unstable right now. That's my daughter. Holly. Daddy was wrong. It was Daddy's fault. Holly. I slowly smiled, my vision blurring. I realized I couldn't remember how Dad used to call me when I was little. Holly. I am Mom's Holly. Quentin arrived late at night. I lay propped up against the headboard, feigning sleep, and heard the sound of the door opening. When I opened my eyes, I saw Quentin gently closing the door. The room was dark, with only the moonlight streaming through the window faintly illuminating his figure. Quentin pulled a chair over to the bedside and sat down silently. After 2 days, his eye sockets seemed hollow, his lips colorless, and the back that had always been straight since his youth was now slumped and bent. I watched him calmly. Are you here to mock me? Or to plead for your sister and mother? Holly. Quentin's voice was hoarse, struggling to speak. My sister brought this on herself, but my mom, she knew nothing about this. I remained silent, watching as Quentin's tears fell unbidden. Did it hurt when the child left you? In the dark hospital room, we stared at each other in silence, like a duel without words. Moonlight streamed through the iron bars outside the window, casting varying shadows on my blanket. At first glance, it seemed as though the shadow of a prison had been cast into the room. It hurt. I spoke first, releasing the pent-up anguish from my chest. I watched him leave my body. I'm sorry, Quentin cried, his thin back shaking uncontrollably. I'm so sorry, so sorry. His back was almost bent to the floor. I looked down at him coldly, realizing it was time to say something. This child probably never imagined being killed by his own aunt. Though the words were harsh, their effect was immediate. Quentin's head shot up, his face turning pale, his lips trembling. Holly, you. Quentin tried to stand, but his legs gave out, and he fell to the floor with a thud, his eyes full of despair under the moonlight. You know. Quentin looked at me with hope in his eyes. Do you know that this child is mine? Even so, you still decided to keep the child. Quentin cried and laughed, mumbling like a madman. Daddy loves you and Mommy loves you too. Quentin knelt beside my bed, forcing a smile as he reached out to hold my hand. I quietly pulled my hand away. With that one motion, the glimmer of hope in Quentin's eyes vanished instantly. "Did you keep this child to take revenge on me?" Quentin lowered his head in defeat. "I should have known. You should have known." I smiled gently. "That night, it was intentional. If it's a girl, name her Bella. If it's a boy, name him Wesley." Quentin's voice was muffled under the blanket, weak and pale. The white sheets were crumpled in his hands. "I once thought about that. Have you named him?" I did not answer him further, only watched, savoring his despair and breakdown. He humbly sought an answer from me, wanting to prove that, like him, I also loved the child in my womb. The coincidences and expectations he once dared not express in his youth, he had shared the same hopes I did. To me, he was just a thorny mess. "Quentin." I reached out to touch his head, the gesture both gentle and deadly. I said, "As long as you could bring my mother back to life, I would willingly bear your child." Quentin looked up, his eyes red, pleading with me. "Holly, hate me as much as you want, I beg you. Leave my mother alone. I don't believe you acted without Miranda's orders when you drugged me." I spoke clearly, like a boulder rolling down a cliff. "I won't let her off. If..." Quentin's eyes were red, his voice trembling. "If your mother blackmailed you into doing something you didn't want to do, threatening you as if you didn't exist, would you still do it?" "Quentin." I looked at the man before me calmly. "I wouldn't have such a mother." Quentin seemed momentarily dazed, his grip on my hand loosening. He stared at me blankly, despair flowing from his eyes. He moved his lips, and his voice was a helpless sigh. "But that's my mother. Get out." This was the second time I said it, looking at Quentin without pity, repeating myself. "Get out, Quentin." Quentin staggered to his feet. He glanced back at me deeply before leaving. We both knew this was the end. A few days later, Jenna would face trial for this incident, and Miranda would certainly demand that Quentin desperately save her daughter. Even if Quentin was unwilling, he would have to stand against me. He knew I wouldn't spare his mother. I turned to look at the moonlight outside the window. It was so cold and gentle, and my heart was unexpectedly calm. Since Miranda had always used her children, Jenna's trial should naturally drag her biological mother to hell with her. On the day of Jenna's court hearing, I managed to slip out of the hospital through connections and took a seat in the gallery, wearing a mask, quietly waiting for the drama to unfold once more. The main players gradually took their places. I watched coldly as Miranda, with a scowl on her face and a noticeably swollen belly, walked in. She seemed to be complaining to Quentin beside her. Quentin looked exhausted, sitting far from Miranda with a vacant expression. For him, it was likely a tormenting experience, as if he were sitting on pins and needles, adding fuel to the fire. The last principal character to arrive was my father, who entered with a weary expression. Miranda immediately approached him with a look of grievance, but he merely glanced at her, withdrew his arm, and silently found a seat. It was ironic how a family that once sat together happily at the dinner table was now in separate corners, each silent. The court session began. Jenna, dressed in a yellow prison uniform and looking worn out, was brought in. Miranda immediately started crying, creating a stark contrast in the silent courtroom. The bailiffs quietly reminded her to keep quiet, and she reluctantly complied. Jenna appeared disoriented upon hearing Miranda's cries, nervously lowering her head and glancing at her defense attorney. It seemed that the defense attorney I had bribed had performed his task well. Jenna had lost any confidence she might have had about escaping this trial. I had subtly hinted to Jenna through her defense attorney that, if pregnant, she could request a postponement of sentencing or even medical parole. Though Jenna was devoted to her mother, the opportunity was too tempting to ignore. After all, Miranda, the mastermind behind her troubles, was pregnant. If she truly cared for her daughter, she wouldn't want Jenna to waste her youth in prison. The trial proceeded quickly. Facing the evidence presented step by my attorney, and the psychological evaluation from the doctor stating my mental state after the loss of the child, Jenna's lawyer was left speechless multiple times. Seeing Jenna shaking more and more, her delicate face filled with terror, the final step came. My lawyer presented a video. In it, Jenna's biological father described in detail how Miranda had tricked him into going to India to earn money, and the subsequent false accusations of domestic violence and rape he faced. The video included photos of him only borrowing money from his former employer, yet being falsely accused of torturing her. The video had been recorded before the incident, when he had pleaded with me to spare Jenna. I had him record the video accusing Miranda in advance, and it turned out to be useful after his death. More importantly, he had intended to take Jenna away to a new life, so the video made no mention of Jenna, completely distancing her from the accusations. For Jenna, who seemed to be struggling like a drowning person, this was undoubtedly a lifeline. It wasn't me. Jenna finally broke down, pointing at Miranda, who was pale and sitting in the gallery. Mother and daughter turned against each other. Jenna screamed in agony. "It was my mom. My mom made me do it. She made me crash into them." Jenna cried, her tears flowing freely, no longer the graceful dancer she once was on stage. "It was my mom who made me do it. My mom made me crash into them." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Miranda, trembling, stood up protectively over her belly, but before she could say anything, someone had already grabbed her by the neck. The person holding her was her own biological son. Quentin's eyes were bloodshot, and he looked ready to burst into flames as he glared at Miranda, seemingly wanting to burn her to ashes. "Why? I told you that was my child. Why did you kill him?" Faced with the bloody truth, Quentin had to accept that the mother he had always defended had killed the child he cherished. Bailiffs came forward to restrain Quentin, pulling him away. Miranda was gasping for breath, her face turning red. Quentin, overwhelmed with grief, cried tears of despair, staring intensely at Miranda, his biological mother, and shouting with all his might, "Mom! Mom! That was my own child. I told you clearly. Why? That was my child. Mom!" The bailiff struggled to restrain Quentin, who was still desperately trying to reach Miranda. My father, numbly standing up, walked over to Miranda, who was being supported by others, and grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to face him. "You lied to me," Father murmured. "You lied to me, saying it was her who did it. You deceived me." The bailiffs held down Quentin, who was still struggling on the floor, his eyes red as he glared at Miranda and roared, wanting to attack her. For a moment, no one intervened to stop Father's actions. "What did I ever do to wrong you? What did I ever do to you?" Father asked Miranda in a broken voice. "You said you were going to marry someone with the last name Gu. You told me to stay away from you. Even if she had someone bully you, it would only have been a few slaps. Why do you hate her so much?" "I've hated her for so many years." Father forcefully threw Miranda to the ground and clutched his head in agony. "Ah! If it hadn't been for her and her daughter, you would have married me." Miranda gasped, lying on the floor, her eyes red and defiant. "You promised you'd wait for me. But when I finally divorced, you married that woman. If you just divorced and married me, I would still be with you." Miranda glared at Father with resentment. "But you stayed with that woman and her daughter. Because of them, I ended up marrying a driver. I married the driver who drove for that woman, and he even shamelessly borrowed money from her. Why is this happening?" Miranda roared with frustration. Father staggered back a few steps and turned to see Quentin pinned to the floor. He screamed in pain and lunged at Quentin, but was firmly restrained by the bailiffs. "What does it mean that she's carrying your child? When did you get close to her?" Father kept yelling at his son. "What did you do to her? Bastard! Bastard!" Amid the chaos, the judge declared a recess. As the bailiffs were escorting them out, Miranda suddenly screamed, and blood began to flow from beneath her. As an elderly expectant mother, such a shock was likely to endanger the baby. I watched them quietly. This fractured family was now torn apart. Mother and daughter at odds, mother and son in enmity, husband and wife turned against each other, and father and son at odds. In terms of human morality, they had been thoroughly condemned. Now only the law remained. Father's past actions, hiding Miranda's mother's involvement in the case, had greatly obstructed justice. I had submitted the relevant materials to the court. As for Miranda and Jenna, one as the principal offender and the other as an accomplice, Miranda would lose her child and face imprisonment for murder and false accusations. While in prison, she might remember her former life as a wealthy woman. Jenna, burdened with a criminal record, would never return to the stage. Without her biological and stepfather, she had nothing left. After her release, she would have no home, no family, no job, and no savings. As for Quentin, aside from the incident where he drugged me, there was no other evidence to accuse him of wrongdoing. He had only committed one mistake against me, yet it had caused a tidal wave of consequences. Despite being the origin of all these wrongs and my intense desire to drag him to hell, apart from using the child and his biological mother to make him suffer, I had no other means. He would, like me, be tormented by guilt and pain for the rest of his life. As I left the courthouse, the sky was bright and sunny with no clouds in sight. I looked up at the sky, squinting slightly, feeling the breeze brush past me. Holding my mother's urn, every gust of wind felt like it carried away a part of her. My mother wasn't in the urn. She wasn't trapped in this box. She had left, and that too was a form of liberation. Mom! I smiled at the deep blue sky, tears blurring my vision. I vaguely remembered a question Hunter once asked me. Holly, if one day you succeed in getting revenge, what do you want to do next? He had looked at me with bright eyes, waiting for my response. At that time, one of my hands was bound to the bed railing, and the other held a book as I looked up at him in a daze. The sunlight outside was still bright, warm, and gentle. I want to see my mother. If my mother hadn't jumped off that building, hadn't sought death, if I hadn't tried to teach Jenna a lesson, hadn't tried to vent my anger, if I hadn't stopped Quentin that day, the day Miranda took the photos, my mother was actually going to see Quentin. She trusted my words and told Quentin to stay away from me, which happened to coincide with her meeting that man. Her good intentions in lending money turned into evidence used against her. If it hadn't been for me and Quentin, my mother wouldn't have died. The wind, carrying the warmth of the sun, brushed against my face. I seemed to see 18-year-old Holly with her ponytail swaying, her hair brushing against her white neck. She smiled as she walked in the sunlight, her eyes slightly squinted, shining brilliantly. At 23, why do I already feel so old? Hunter Extra. Holly's ending, prologue. On the day Holly left, I packed up her diary. Each page detailed her past, and as I flipped through, I found my name written here and there. Was there a touch more tenderness and nostalgia when she wrote my name? The first time I heard Holly's name, the tragedy had already occurred. Holly's mother had jumped from the rooftop due to depression. When I heard this terrible news, my mother cried inconsolably for the first time, and even my usually stern father had reddened eyes. My mother and I attended the memorial service. It was the first time I saw Holly. She wore a black dress, her face was pale, and her long hair was somewhat disheveled. She had delicate features and a face like a fragile glass doll, as if it would shatter with the slightest touch. Quentin, my so-called brother, and his biological mother also attended. It turned out that his biological mother had a past with Holly's father. Ugh, how disgusting. An old woman crying in the dead person's mourning hall, clinging to her husband. Holly's expression seemed to crack under the weight of it all. I was curious about what had happened between them. Later, I transferred to Holly's high school and learned the reason for her departure. The incident had caused quite a stir, and I still heard boys talking about Holly behind her back. The harm she suffered then must have been even greater than it was now. Although I had never seen her at school, it felt like I had known her for a long time. Her awards photos and name seemed to be everywhere. I admit that I had ulterior motives when I first approached Holly. Because of Quentin. The shared half-sibling blood made our relationship antagonistic, especially given the fierce opposition between our mothers. So I was particularly eager to learn more about Quentin through Holly. During my senior year, as my mother was overwhelmed with my issues and feeling guilty over the news from the US, I didn't understand why she felt guilt over Holly's suicide. But I took the initiative to go with her to the US, and when I saw Holly again after 2 years, her face had become even smaller, her chin sharper, and her eyes larger due to hollowing. Despite having heard so much about her, I didn't know what to say. I could only stand there, silently moving in front of her. That time when she locked herself in her room really frightened me. I broke open the locked door and pulled her out of the wardrobe. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes curled up, her wrists already bleeding. What a foolish woman. She tortured herself with guilt and regret. To onlookers, it seemed like she just couldn't move on from the past, and I was one of those onlookers. Later, I realized that Holly was only 18 at the time. Perhaps she had dreams and hopes for the future. But witnessing her mother's suicide, her father's disbelief, and the marriage to that old woman, she must have been devastated. According to my mother, Holly had been in a state of collapse for nearly 2 years. Her so-called father didn't dare to visit her. She was unwilling to let him and the old woman know about her suffering, even in death. I felt like I was getting to understand her more, but she seemed to be drifting further away from me. If she had wanted revenge, my mother, father, and I would have helped her. Yet she never asked anyone for help. Returning to her home country with wounds, facing those family members. Why was she so stubborn? I really couldn't understand. When her revenge ended, she took over the company her mother had left behind, voluntarily merging it with our family's company, and left after only retaining the original company's shares. I understood her motives, so I stubbornly followed her. She traveled to New Zealand, Colombia, and many other places, and I accompanied her. Eventually, she rented a small house in a rural town in Spain and settled there. I lived next door to her, greeting her every morning, and then going together to buy groceries. Mrs. Maria's produce was always fresh with morning dew, and occasionally, I would see Lucas whizzing by on his bicycle like the wind. People sometimes referred to Holly and me as a couple, and Holly politely explained our relationship with a gentle smile. They all said Holly was the most beautiful Chinese girl they had ever seen. Sometimes I wondered if Holly had truly let go. After all, Mrs. Maria's yogurt was delicious, Miss Anita's small tavern served sweet and pure wine, and Mr. Braulio's jokes were always witty and humorous. With so many wonderful things, surely something must have made her stay. She always smiled, and her smile made me think she might forget the past and start anew. That day, I bought some elegant lilies covered in dew. Their delicate fragrance and soft pink-white petals were lovely, and Holly liked them a lot. But even the most beautiful flowers eventually wither. A week later, I threw the wilted lilies into the trash, planning to buy a new bouquet the next day. What should I buy? Vivid roses or charming daisies? Either would seem perfect for Holly. The next day, Holly asked with a smile, "Where did the lilies you bought yesterday go?" I took Holly to the hospital again. The doctor said Holly's mental state was deteriorating. Her hallucinations were no longer confined to dreams, but were beginning to affect her real life. She was slowly forgetting events, becoming more like a blank slate. Holly had started keeping a diary at this time. I flipped to a page and saw her elegant handwriting, quietly complaining that I had drunk the yogurt Mrs. Maria sent. My eyes welled up. Mrs. Maria hadn't sent yogurt in a long time, and I didn't know which moment Holly's memory was stuck on. I secretly visited Mrs. Maria, begging for some yogurt. I placed it neatly in the most visible spot in the refrigerator. On the next page of the diary, Holly complained again about me moving her yogurt and how the placement was wrong. I couldn't help but laugh. Holly always smiled gently at everyone, but secretly complained about me in her diary. She complained that the dew on Mrs. Maria's vegetables was sprinkled by herself just to make them look fresher. She also complained about Mr. Braulio's jokes, saying the same jokes repeatedly. But these were all just her memories. I began to intentionally create the world from her memories, carefully maintaining it. She thought the traces of daily life in her memories were accurate. Sometimes I felt confused about whether it was right or wrong to deceive Holly's memory with a false appearance. But when I first told Holly about the discrepancies in her memories, her expression was so heart-wrenching. Holly kept apologizing in a low voice, afraid her condition would affect my life. Holly, you didn't do anything wrong. You were just endlessly missing your mother in your dreams." I heard her mumbling in her sleep, her dreams only filled with the deceased. I never heard my name. The night before Holly left, I felt nothing. That night, Holly looked at me and smiled. She told me she had a great day, and felt she would dream about everything that happened today, including me. The next day, she left in her dreams, her expression calm. I numbly contacted my parents. Accompanied by Mrs. Maria and others, I watched Holly and wept uncontrollably. In reality, I still couldn't keep her. Did she dream of me last night? The news of Holly's passing reached me in China, and Quentin came to see me. He had confessed to the police that he had drugged Holly and took advantage of her when she was unconscious. He tried to take the blame entirely, but his prison time was still short. It was the greatest punishment he could impose on himself. Was she in pain when she left? Quentin's voice was hoarse and weathered, his hands covered in wounds. I wondered what kind of life he had been leading in the country. She was always happy. She spent each day happily and then went to her mother in her dreams. Quentin responded softly, lowering his head. I could even hear his bones creaking. Your health? I couldn't help but ask. Quentin looked up at me with a smile, many wrinkles around his eyes. The doctor said there's nothing wrong, but I feel worse every day. I might die soon. Exhausted in body and spirit, that seemed to describe him perfectly. Quentin had lost Holly, his child, and his biological mother. He now had nothing. But I can't die yet. Quentin stared at his coffee cup, murmuring absently. Miranda is still alive and so is Jenna. They can't have a single good day, not even one. Quentin's expression was like a venomous snake hunting, fixating on those two people. Perhaps he wouldn't be free until they were dead. How many years would that take? I seemed to see all of Holly's hatred in him, darkly festering within him. He sought revenge for Holly against everyone, using any dirty means. That's fine. Holly's hands remain clean, whether in life or death. Thank you. Quentin bowed his head in thanks. Thank you. He didn't specify for what he was thanking me, but each word seemed to cut into his flesh. He numbly smiled at me, then stood up and stumbled away. His back was already hunched, and one of his legs seemed to limp. I didn't ask if he regretted it. Did Holly ever ask? Perhaps Quentin asked himself every day and tortured himself with the answers. He would never forgive himself. Like Holly, she never forgave them, not even herself, until the end. On the day Holly was buried, I saw her father. Holly had chosen her gravesite next to her mother's. As we were sending her off, I saw her father at the cemetery gate. He guarded the cemetery where his wife and daughter were buried. We exchanged a few words and he thanked me, his frail figure bowing with difficulty. He said he had wanted to die but realized that if he did, no one would care for Holly and her mother's graves, clean the tombstones or offer flowers and incense. On the day Holly was buried, the autumn rain fell steadily. Even though it was daytime, the sky was dark and windy, and the fine breeze was cold. Holly's photo was misted with black and white fog. Holly, Holly. I wiped the fog from Holly's photo. The 18-year-old Holly smiled at me, her eyes shining brightly. This was the photo Holly had chosen for herself. She had never been able to move beyond her 18th year. Holly, farewell. Years later, after graduating from graduate school, I started working at my father's company. My mother's health worsened day by day. I began to understand Holly's feelings. Even though I had become a responsible man, I couldn't accept my mother's passing. How could an 18-year-old like Holly cope? When Bowen High School held its alumni reunion, I attended. This time it was held in the school's large auditorium. The new principal told me that today's students were very difficult to manage, so they had specially invited outstanding alumni to give lectures. I had my assistant quickly prepare a speech, went up, read it and left. I had once been a troublesome student, causing many headaches for teachers and parents. I never expected that one day I would be among the invited outstanding alumni. Now, accustomed to wearing suits, I looked at the students in their youthful uniforms and felt a wave of emotions. After the speech, they began to show a video of outstanding alumni's achievements. I couldn't imagine what kind of video my assistant had provided them, so I watched intently. In the swiftly changing photos, I saw a fleeting image of Holly. The new principal asked me to find the old principal. The old principal took me to the old archives room and pulled out a video of Holly dancing from years ago. I sat in the screening room, carefully watching Holly, gracefully dancing in a flowing dress like a butterfly. She had been so beautiful back then. The old principal next to me cried as he watched. He said Holly had been like a child he had watched grow up, and she was the child of his most accomplished student. Her passing had been a great pain for him. He felt heartache for Holly, her mother's death, her father's infidelity, and for Holly, who at such a young age, could only secretly watch her mother's old videos. When did Holly come? The old principal kept nagging about scheduling a time to drink his last bottle of wine with me. I wasn't interested in the wine. I just wanted to know what film Holly had watched here back then. I borrowed the tape from the principal. The video quality from nearly 30 years ago was moving, but I still recognized the face in the footage. It looked very similar to Holly, gentle, serene, and beautiful. I also saw two people beside Holly's mother, my parents. I knew my dad and Holly's mother had been childhood friends, but I didn't realize my mom was also their closest friend. Watching the way my dad frequently glanced at Holly's mother in the video, I began to understand why my mom felt so guilty towards Holly. I also realized why Holly had insisted on avoiding me. The tragedy of the previous generation had extended to her, and she didn't want to drag more people into this mess. What kind of mood would one have when watching a tape alone in a dim screening room? Holly, so many years have passed. Why, even when I understand your intentions back then, do I still cry uncontrollably? I gave the tape to my mom. She cried as she watched it. She said Holly's mother's mistreatment of Miranda was actually to stand up for her. She said that once Holly's mother knew that the person she liked was my dad, she kept her distance from him. Even in Holly's mother's despair, she didn't seek help from her childhood friend who was already married. But my mom was too afraid, so after she married, she kept even more distance from Holly's mother. When she heard about Holly's mother's death and saw Holly's condition, she regretted so much that she almost cried her life away. But what use is regret? Now her health deteriorates day by day as she murmurs, "It's all retribution." No matter how much she confesses at the grave, this guilt grows from the depths of her heart, like a worm that she can't shake off. My mom asked me to give the tape to my dad. After Holly's mother's death, she finally understood how embarrassing she was when she was so petty back then. I placed the tape on my dad's desk. I really didn't know how to discuss this with him. The next day, the tape was gone, and there was a new locked drawer in his office. Holly's mother and Holly were similar to my dad. They both could restrain their emotions, never crossing boundaries, and never forcing what wasn't meant to be. Holly's mother chose friends over childhood sweethearts. After she knew my mom's feelings, she made her choice. And my dad, if it weren't for that video, I wouldn't even have known how much he liked Holly's mother back then. Holly, because of the tragedy of the previous generation, didn't want any more melodramatic tragedies to happen. So she always avoided me. Even in the final days, she carefully maintained our relationship, never crossing the line or leaving me any hope. Holly, did you not seek any help from us because you knew we weren't sincere? I approached you with other motives. My mom acted out of guilt, and my dad avoided suspicion, becoming as if he had never known your mother after marriage. None of us were truly sincere towards you. But after your deaths, we wept and repented, regretting our indifference and our negligence towards you, regretting that we thought you could heal on your own and let go. If our relationship had changed from the beginning, your mother might not have died. Holly's father died. I heard that Jenna, after being released from prison, faced many setbacks and ended up working as a hostess in a nightclub, hoping to climb the social ladder like her mother. Instead, she was merely played and ended up as a notorious young lady. One day, she got drunk and went to the cemetery to curse Holly and her mother, even kicking their tombstones. Holly's father went to stop her but was pushed to the ground. Jenna fled in fear, and he slowly lost his life in the cold night. It was the end of winter and the beginning of spring, with cold weather and small snowflakes mixed in the chilly wind. When he was found, his face was covered with a thick layer of frost, and there were 2 lines of white ice hanging prominently under his hollow eyes. Jenna was sent back to prison. After killing her biological father, she also accidentally killed her stepfather. This time she would likely be imprisoned for many years. Holly's father was also buried in this cemetery, in a spot he had chosen himself, far from Holly and her mother but still within sight of them. When I went to offer incense and pay my respects to him, I brought a photo of Miranda's death. I had arranged for someone to make Miranda's life in prison a living hell. In the photo, Miranda's eyes were vacant, her face was covered in wounds, and her face was filthy, with her head seemingly broken, weakly leaning against a toilet. I intended to show it to Holly but feared she might be angry since she didn't want me involved. So I burned the photo for Holly's mother. Holly was so close by. "Auntie, if you see this, please tell Holly not to blame me." I half squatted in front of the tombstone, paused, and changed my words. It's okay if she blames me. Let her come and scold me in her dreams. I missed her a little. Holly, I still haven't dreamed of you. Have you seen your mother there? Holly, I always think back to that day when you locked yourself in your room and said nothing. Everyone was anxious but helpless. I used a kitchen knife to break down your door and pulled you out of the wardrobe. Your frightened face looked up at me as I pulled you out, but I couldn't pull you into the sunlight.